The wagon lurched to a violent stop outside the grand three-story mansion, nearly throwing Benjamin Hayes from his seat as 6 pairs of eyes peered down at him from various windows like predators studying their next meal. What he had expected was a quiet widow in need of companionship and help managing her late husband's affairs. What he found was a battlefield disguised as a family home, and the war was about to begin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Pacific Railroad's afternoon express wheezed into the small but prosperous station of Millfield, California, carrying with it the hopes and considerable apprehensions of one Benjamin Hayes. At 34, he was a man who had learned to read situations quickly, a skill that had kept him alive during his years as a frontier schoolteacher in the rough mining camps of Nevada Territory. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what awaited him at the end of this particular journey. Benjamin adjusted his collar as he stepped onto the wooden platform, his single worn leather satchel containing everything he owned in the world. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prosperous farming community, where well-maintained buildings and paved streets spoke of money and stability. It was a far cry from the dusty, lawless towns where he'd spent the last decade, and he allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The advertisement in the San Francisco Chronicle had been brief but compelling. Widowed lady of means seeks educated gentleman for companionship and assistance with family matters. Comfortable living arrangements and generous compensation assured. Serious inquiries only. What had caught his attention wasn't just the promise of financial security, but the emphasis on education and family matters. After years of trying to teach rowdy miners' sons their letters, while dodging flying bottles and the occasional gunshot, the prospect of a refined household seemed like paradise. Mrs. Eleanor Richardson had responded to his carefully worded letter with surprising speed. Her correspondence revealed a woman of obvious breeding and education, recently widowed after 20 years of marriage to a successful cattle rancher. She wrote eloquently about her need for assistance managing her late husband's extensive business interests while raising 6 children ranging in age from 5 to 17. The salary she offered was more than generous, enough to allow Benjamin to save money for the first time in his adult life, perhaps even enough to eventually start the small private academy he dreamed of founding. Their exchange of letters had continued for 2 months, each correspondence revealing more about their mutual circumstances. Eleanor Richardson painted a picture of a household in need of masculine guidance and intellectual stimulation. Her late husband had been a practical man, she explained, more concerned with cattle prices than literature, leaving her children somewhat undisciplined and lacking in proper education. Benjamin found himself genuinely looking forward to meeting this articulate woman and her family, imagining cozy evenings discussing philosophy while well-behaved children practiced their lessons nearby. The reality that greeted him at Millfield Station was his first indication that Mrs. Richardson's letters might have omitted certain crucial details. Mr. Hayes? The voice belonged to a stout man with weathered hands and worried eyes who approached Benjamin with the cautious air of someone delivering bad news. "I'm Jacob Morrison, Mrs. Richardson's foreman. Mom sent me to collect you." Benjamin shook the offered hand, noting the man's firm grip and the way his eyes seemed to be assessing him for something more than mere politeness. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Morrison. I trust Mrs. Richardson is well." Morrison's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "She's well enough, I suppose, though you might want to reserve judgment on that until you've been at Riverside Ranch for more than 5 minutes. He gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 patient-looking horses. "Best get moving. The children will be expecting you, and that's never a good thing for anyone involved. The comment struck Benjamin as odd, but he climbed aboard the wagon without comment. As they rolled through Millfield's quiet streets, Morrison maintained an uncomfortable silence that seemed loaded with unspoken warnings. Benjamin attempted conversation several times, asking about the ranch, the local community, and the Richardson family. But each inquiry was met with non-committal grunts or cryptic responses that raised more questions than they answered. "Tell me about the children," Benjamin finally said as they left the town behind and entered rolling hills dotted with grazing cattle. Mrs. Richardson mentioned they're in need of educational guidance. Morrison shot him a look that might have been pity. Educational guidance, that's one way to put it, I suppose. He was quiet for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "Look, Mr. Hayes, you seem like a decent fellow, and I'd hate to see you go in completely unprepared. Those Richardson children, well, let's just say they've run off 4 governesses, 3 tutors, and 2 housekeepers in the past year alone." Benjamin felt his stomach sink slightly. Surely they can't be that difficult. Children often act out when they've lost a parent. "It's natural grief reaction." "Grief?" Morrison snorted. "That's generous. More like they've been allowed to run completely wild since their father died. Mrs. Richardson, bless her heart, has about as much control over those young hellions as she does over the weather, and they know it." The wagon crested a hill, and Benjamin got his first glimpse of Riverside Ranch spread out in the valley below. The main house was an impressive 3-story structure built in the fashionable Victorian style, with wraparound porches, ornate gingerbread trim, and enough windows to light a small town. Surrounding it were numerous outbuildings, corrals and pastures where hundreds of cattle grazed contentedly. It was clearly a prosperous operation, confirming Mrs. Richardson's claims about her comfortable circumstances. What Morrison had failed to mention, however, was the current state of the main house's exterior. As they drew closer, Benjamin could see that several windows sported cracks or missing panes, temporarily covered with boards or canvas. The ornate porch railings showed signs of recent damage, with one section hanging at an alarming angle. Most disturbing of all, scorch marks around one of the ground floor windows suggested that someone had recently attempted to set fire to part of the building. "What happened here?" Benjamin asked, his optimism rapidly evaporating. "Tuesday," Morrison replied grimly. "Or maybe it was Wednesday. Hard to keep track anymore. That was when young Samuel decided to test his theory about whether lamp oil would make a better explosive than gunpowder. Turns out it doesn't, but it sure makes an impressive fire." Benjamin stared at the damage in growing horror. Samuel. How old is Samuel? 10. The wagon pulled up to the front steps, and Benjamin could see curtains twitching at various windows as unseen observers tracked their arrival. The front door stood slightly ajar, and he could hear what sounded like furniture being moved around inside, accompanied by voices raised in argument or perhaps warfare. Morrison climbed down from the wagon and began unloading Benjamin's meager luggage with movements that suggested long practice in hasty retreats. "Mrs. Richardson should be in the parlor, assuming the children haven't barricaded her in again. That happened last Thursday. Took us 3 hours to get her out." They barricaded their own mother in a room. "Oh, they weren't trying to trap her," Morrison clarified helpfully. "They were trying to keep 10-year-old Margaret out after she declared war on 12-year-old Emma over some dispute about hair ribbons. Mrs. Richardson just got caught in the crossfire." Benjamin shouldered his satchel and approached the front steps with the growing realization that his carefully laid plans for a peaceful, scholarly life might need significant revision. The front door swung open before he could knock, revealing a harried-looking woman in her late 30s, with auburn hair escaping from what had once been an elegant chignon, and a dress that showed clear evidence of recent combat. "Mr. Hayes," Mrs. Eleanor Richardson's voice carried genuine relief, mixed with something that might have been desperation. "Thank goodness you've arrived. Please come in quickly before they realize you're here." She ushered him through a foyer that had clearly once been magnificent, but now showed signs of recent siege warfare. A crystal chandelier hung at an odd angle, several of its arms bent and missing globes. The wallpaper bore suspicious stains and what appeared to be small impact craters. A marble-topped side table had been overturned and hastily righted, its surface now sporting several interesting chips and cracks. "I do apologize for the condition of things," Mrs. Richardson said, leading him through the chaos with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate disaster zones. "The children have been especially energetic since learning of your imminent arrival. I'm afraid the prospect of a new authority figure has prompted them to demonstrate their territorial claims." From somewhere upstairs came the sound of running feet, followed by a tremendous crash and a voice that could only belong to a very angry young person shouting, "That's what you get for touching my chemistry set, you little savage." Mrs. Richardson closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength from some internal reservoir. "That would be 15-year-old Caroline. She's our aspiring scientist. Last week, she successfully created what I believe chemists call a controlled explosion in the root cellar. Unfortunately, no one informed the root cellar that the explosion was supposed to be controlled." Benjamin found himself momentarily speechless. The woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the composed, articulate correspondent who had written such thoughtful letters about the challenges of raising children alone. This Eleanor Richardson looked like someone who had been through a prolonged military campaign and was beginning to crack under the pressure. "Mrs. Richardson," he began carefully, "perhaps we should discuss the specific challenges I might expect to encounter in my role here." "Oh yes, absolutely," she replied, with the bright desperation of someone trying to maintain polite society standards while their world crumbled around them. "But first, let me show you to your room so you can freshen up after your journey. The children are currently occupied with their afternoon activities, so we should have a few minutes of relative peace." She led him up a grand staircase that had seen better days, its banister wobbling ominously and several balusters showing signs of having been used as weapons or climbing apparatus. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. "Your room is here at the end of the hall," Mrs. Richardson explained, producing a key from her pocket. "I've had a lock installed, which I highly recommend you use. Not that the children are malicious, you understand, but they do have a tendency to explore when curiosity strikes them." The room she showed him was spacious and well-appointed, with a large bed, writing desk, and comfortable reading chair, positioned near tall windows that looked out over the ranch's impressive grounds. It was exactly the sort of accommodation Benjamin had hoped for, assuming one ignored the bars that had been recently installed on the windows. "The bars are a recent addition," Mrs. Richardson explained, following his gaze. "After 17-year-old Jonathan decided to test whether a rope made from bedsheets would support his weight during a midnight escape attempt. It would have, actually, if 8-year-old Timothy hadn't decided to help by cutting the rope while Jonathan was halfway down." Benjamin set his satchel on the bed and turned to face his new employer directly. The time for polite pretense had clearly passed. "Mrs. Richardson, I feel I should be completely honest with you. Your letters led me to believe I would be tutoring children who needed educational guidance and discipline. What you're describing sounds more like a military operation." To his surprise, Eleanor Richardson's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment he saw past the desperate cheerfulness to the exhausted woman beneath. "Mr. Hayes, I won't lie to you any longer. When my husband died 18 months ago, these children lost more than their father. They lost the only person who could control them, James had a way with them, a natural authority that kept their exuberance channeled in productive directions. Since his death, they've become increasingly wild, and she paused, struggling with the admission, I have completely lost control of my own household. Benjamin felt his sympathy stirring despite his growing alarm. The woman before him was clearly at the end of her rope, dealing with circumstances that would challenge far more experienced parents. What happened to the previous tutors and governesses? Eleanor's laugh held a note of hysteria. The first governess, Miss Pemberton, lasted exactly 6 days. Caroline convinced her that the children suffered from a rare tropical disease that could only be treated with complete isolation and specialized diet consisting entirely of candy. The second governess made it 3 weeks before Samuel successfully convinced her that the house was haunted by the ghost of a particularly angry bull that had been killed on the property. And the tutors? Mr. Davidson, our first tutor, was a mathematics specialist from San Francisco. He departed rather suddenly after Emma and Margaret convinced him that their father had left specific instructions in his will that any adult who raised his voice to the children would immediately forfeit half their yearly wages to the local orphanage. He spent 2 weeks trying to teach fractions in whispers before discovering that James left no such provisions in his will, primarily because James had never whispered to these children in his entire life. Benjamin rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache. And you still believe I can succeed where others have failed? Eleanor Richardson straightened her shoulders, and for a moment Benjamin caught a glimpse of the strength that had attracted a successful rancher and managed to raise 6 children, however chaotic their current state. Mr. Hayes, your letters revealed a man with both patience and principles. You've taught in frontier mining camps, dealt with rough men and difficult circumstances. These are children, not hardened criminals. They need firm guidance, consistent discipline, and someone who won't be intimidated by their antics. From downstairs came the sound of something large and wooden hitting the floor, followed by multiple voices raised in heated debate. Eleanor sighed deeply. They also need someone who won't give up on them. Whatever their faults, they're good children at heart. They're just testing boundaries that haven't existed since their father died. Benjamin walked to the barred window and looked out at the peaceful ranch grounds, where cattle grazed contentedly and the late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light. It looked like paradise, assuming one could ignore the war zone that was apparently the main house. He thought about his alternatives: return to San Francisco with his tail between his legs, take another position teaching in some godforsaken mining camp, or stay and face whatever challenges 6 grieving, undisciplined children could devise. The decision, when he made it, surprised him with its certainty. Very well, Mrs. Richardson, I'll stay. But I'll need your complete support in establishing discipline and routine. No undermining my authority, no matter how pitiful they make themselves appear. Eleanor's relief was so profound it was almost visible. Anything you need, Mr. Hayes. Anything at all. As if summoned by their agreement, the sound of approaching footsteps thundered up the stairs, accompanied by voices engaged in some sort of strategic planning session. Benjamin had just enough time to brace himself before the door burst open, and 6 pairs of eyes appeared in the doorway, ranging from calculating to openly hostile. His first glimpse of the Richardson children suggested that his real education was about to begin, and the curriculum would be unlike anything he'd ever encountered before. The war for Riverside Ranch was about to commence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 6 Richardson children filed into Benjamin's room with the coordinated precision of a military unit conducting reconnaissance. They arranged themselves in what was clearly a predetermined formation. oldest to youngest, each positioned to maximize their psychological impact on the newcomer who dared to enter their domain. 17-year-old Jonathan Richardson stood at the center, clearly the general of this particular army. He possessed his late father's broad shoulders and commanding height, but where James Richardson had used his physical presence to maintain order, Jonathan wielded his like a weapon of intimidation. His dark hair was deliberately disheveled. His clothes bore strategic stains that suggested recent combat, and his blue eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had spent 18 months perfecting the art of chaos. "So," Jonathan drawled, crossing his arms and leaning against the doorframe with studied casualness, "you're the latest victim, tutor, that Mother has imported to try and civilize us." His tone made it clear that he considered the very concept laughable. 15-year-old Caroline flanked him to the right, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the militant gleam in her green eyes. Her dress showed suspicious burn marks and chemical stains that spoke to her scientific pursuits, and she carried what appeared to be a leather satchel that seemed to be softly smoking. When she smiled, Benjamin noticed that her teeth were faintly blue, a detail that suggested her experiments with chemistry had moved beyond the theoretical. "Jonathan's being polite," Caroline observed, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. "What he means to say is that you're the 6th adult in 12 months who's arrived here believing they can succeed where others have catastrophically failed. The actuarial data suggests your odds of lasting more than 3 weeks are approximately 14%. To Jonathan's left stood 14-year-old Emma, a willowy blonde who might have looked angelic if not for the predatory smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Her dress was immaculate, her hair perfectly arranged, and her posture spoke of careful training in ladylike behavior, but her eyes held the cold calculation of a strategist who specialized in psychological warfare. "Caroline's statistics don't account for variables in methodology," Emma said sweetly, her voice carrying the honeyed poison of someone who could destroy reputations with carefully placed whispers. "Previous tutors have fallen victim to obvious physical pranks or crude intimidation tactics. I prefer more sophisticated approaches. There are so many ways to make someone uncomfortable in a household where appearances matter." 12-year-old Samuel bounced slightly on his feet, unable to contain the manic energy that radiated from his compact frame. His red hair stuck up at impossible angles. His freckled face bore several small burns and cuts that appeared to be self-inflicted, and his pockets bulged with what Benjamin suspected were improvised weapons or explosive devices. When he grinned, he revealed a gap where 2 front teeth had recently been knocked out. "Emma's too subtle," Samuel announced with the enthusiasm of someone discussing his favorite sport. "I believe in direct action. Why spend weeks psychologically undermining someone when a well-placed firecracker under their chair during breakfast can achieve the same result in 30 seconds? Efficiency is the key to successful warfare." 10-year-old Margaret stood slightly apart from her siblings, her dark hair braided with military precision and her posture suggesting someone who took orders from no one. Despite being the second youngest, she carried herself with the authority of a seasoned commander, and Benjamin noticed that even Jonathan seemed to defer to her judgment in subtle ways. "Samuel lacks strategic thinking," Margaret observed, in a voice that was eerily mature for her age. "Effective campaigns require careful planning, psychological profiling of the enemy, and coordinated execution of multiple objectives. Random explosions are merely terrorism. What we practice is sophisticated warfare." The youngest, 8-year-old, Timothy, completed the formation by positioning himself directly in front of Benjamin with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand genuine danger. His sandy hair fell into bright blue eyes that sparkled with mischief, and his clothes showed evidence of having been used for climbing, crawling, and general mayhem. He clutched a wooden sword that had clearly seen extensive combat duty. "Are you really going to try and make us behave?" Timothy asked with genuine interest. "Because that would be really exciting," the last tutor cried when Samuel put the snake in his bed, and the governess before that fainted when Caroline's experiment made that really loud boom in the middle of the night. "What's going to make you give up?" Benjamin studied this remarkable assembly and felt a curious mixture of admiration and terror. These children had clearly organized themselves into an efficient unit, dedicated to maintaining their freedom from adult authority. Their coordination was impressive, their tactical awareness sophisticated, and their complete lack of respect for conventional discipline both fascinating and alarming. "Well," Benjamin said finally, settling into his reading chair with deliberate calm, "that's certainly an impressive introduction. I can see why previous tutors found you challenging." He pulled out a small notebook and began writing, causing the children to exchange uncertain glances. "What are you doing?" Caroline demanded, her scientific curiosity overriding her strategic caution. "Taking notes," Benjamin replied without looking up. "Jonathan, natural leader, uses physical intimidation but lacks follow-through. Caroline, intellectually, gifted but emotionally immature, compensates for insecurity with aggressive displays of knowledge. Emma, sophisticated manipulator with excellent understanding of social dynamics, but probably struggles with genuine emotional connections." Emma's perfect composure cracked slightly. "Excuse me?" Benjamin continued writing. "Samuel, creative problem solver with excellent mechanical aptitude but poor impulse control. Margaret, strategically brilliant but probably carries too much responsibility for her age. Timothy, naturally curious and adventurous, but uses misbehavior to gain attention from overwhelmed family members." The silence that followed was unlike anything Benjamin had experienced. The children stared at him, with expressions ranging from outrage to fascination, clearly unprepared for an adult who responded to their intimidation tactics with clinical analysis. "You can't just—" Jonathan began, his commanding presence faltering. "Just what?" Benjamin asked mildly. "Observe. Think. Form opinions based on evidence. I'm afraid that's exactly what teachers do, Mr. Richardson. We study our students to understand how best to help them learn and grow." Margaret stepped forward, her young face set in lines that would have been impressive on a general twice her age. "Mr. Hayes, I think you misunderstand the situation here. We are not students seeking education. We are a family defending our territory from unwanted invasion. The methods you're describing suggest you intend to treat us as problems to be solved, rather than people to be respected." Benjamin set down his notebook and regarded Margaret with genuine interest. "That's an excellent point, Miss Richardson. You're absolutely right that I shouldn't treat you as problems to be solved. People aren't problems. They're individuals with unique needs, talents, and challenges. But I'd argue that you've been treating yourselves as problems for the past 18 months. "What do you mean?" Timothy asked, his natural curiosity overcoming his siblings' strategic caution. "Well," Benjamin said, rising from his chair and walking to the window, "let me ask you something. Do you enjoy living in a house where adults are afraid of you? Where your mother looks exhausted and worried all the time? Where you can't have friends visit because you're afraid they'll get hurt or frightened by the chaos?" The question hit its mark. Benjamin saw Caroline and Emma exchange glances, while Samuel's manic energy seemed to dim slightly. Margaret's military bearing wavered, and even Jonathan's confidence appeared shaken. "We're not afraid of having friends over," Emma protested, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "No?" Benjamin turned back to face them. "When was the last time any of you brought a friend home? When did you last attend a social gathering in town where other families were present? When did your mother last host a dinner party or accept invitations to other people's homes?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Benjamin could see his questions had struck deep, revealing consequences of their behavior that the children had perhaps not fully considered. "It's not our fault that other people can't handle," Caroline began defensively. "Can't handle what?" Benjamin interrupted gently. "Children who set fires, who terrorize visitors, who make it impossible for their own mother to maintain normal social relationships. Caroline, you're 15 years old. In 3 years you'll be ready for marriage and adult responsibilities. Do you really want potential suitors to know you as the girl who drove away 6 tutors with chemical explosives?" Caroline's face flushed, and Benjamin could see he'd touched a nerve she hadn't known existed. "And Jonathan," he continued, turning to the eldest, "you're 17. You should be learning to manage your father's business interests, preparing to take over the ranch operations. Instead, you're spending your time coordinating pranks with children half your age. What happens when your mother needs to rely on you to be the man of the family and all you know how to do is organize chaos?" Jonathan's face went through several changes of expression: anger, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. "I know how to run the ranch," he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier bravado. "Do you?" Benjamin asked quietly. "Because from what I observed during my arrival, the ranch operations seem to be managed entirely by Mr. Morrison and the other hands. When was the last time you spent a full day learning cattle management instead of planning elaborate pranks?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Benjamin could see he'd identified something Jonathan himself had been avoiding: the gap between his self-image as family leader and his actual contributions to the family's welfare. "You think you understand us," Margaret said, her voice steady but uncertain for the first time. "But you don't know what it was like after Father died. You don't know how adults looked at us, like we were broken things that needed to be fixed, like we were problems instead of people who were grieving." Benjamin felt his heart constrict at the pain in her voice. Here was the truth beneath all the defiance. 6 children who had lost their anchor and responded to adult attempts to help by building walls of misbehavior. "You're right, Margaret," he said softly. "I don't know what that felt like, but I do know what it feels like to lose someone important and have adults try to manage your grief instead of respecting it. I lost both my parents when I was 12, and I spent years in boarding schools where teachers treated my anger and sadness like diseases to be cured rather than natural responses to loss." The admission created a different kind of silence, softer, more thoughtful. Benjamin could see the children reassessing him, trying to fit this new information into their understanding of adults as either enemies or weaklings. "But here's what I learned," Benjamin continued, settling back into his chair. "Driving away people who want to help doesn't honor your father's memory. It doesn't protect your family. It just makes everyone more alone and more afraid. Your father raised 6 remarkable children, intelligent, creative, loyal to each other, capable of working together toward common goals. But instead of using those gifts to build something he'd be proud of, you're using them to tear down everything he worked to create." Timothy, who had been growing increasingly restless during the serious conversation, suddenly burst out, "But we don't want to be different. We like each other the way we are. Why should we change just because adults want us to be boring and quiet and proper all the time?" "Who said anything about being boring?" Benjamin asked with a smile. "Timothy, has anyone ever told you that your energy and curiosity are exactly the qualities that make great explorers and inventors? Or that Samuel's mechanical aptitude could make him a brilliant engineer? That Caroline's scientific mind could lead to discoveries that change the world?" He looked around the group, meeting each child's eyes in turn. "Margaret, your strategic thinking could make you an exceptional business leader. Emma, your understanding of people could make you a successful writer or diplomat. Jonathan, your natural leadership abilities could help you build something even greater than what your father achieved. The children stared at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Hope mixed with suspicion, curiosity tempered by wariness. "The question isn't whether you should change who you are," Benjamin said finally. "The question is whether you want to become the best versions of yourselves, or if you're content to remain talented people who waste their gifts on battles that don't matter." From downstairs came the sound of the dinner bell, followed by Mrs. Richardson's voice calling the family to the evening meal. The children looked at each other, clearly uncertain how to process this conversation that had taken such an unexpected turn. "We should go," Jonathan said finally, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "Mother doesn't like it when we're late for dinner." As they filed out of the room, each child seemed lost in thought. Benjamin remained in his chair, watching them go and wondering whether he'd made any progress or simply given them new ammunition for future battles. Only Timothy lingered in the doorway, his young face serious. "Mr. Hayes, did losing your parents really hurt as much as losing our father?" "Yes, Timothy," Benjamin replied honestly. "It hurt more than I thought I could bear. And I made a lot of mistakes trying to make the hurt stop." Timothy nodded solemnly. Maybe we've been making mistakes too." And with that surprisingly mature observation, he scampered after his siblings, leaving Benjamin alone with the growing realization that the Richardson children were far more complex than their reputation suggested, and that winning their trust might be the greatest challenge of his teaching career. The Richardson family dining room had clearly been designed for formal entertaining, with its gleaming mahogany table, crystal chandelier, and oil paintings of distinguished ancestors gazing down from gilded frames. However, the reality of dinner at Riverside Ranch bore little resemblance to the genteel family meals those stern-faced portraits had once witnessed. Benjamin descended the grand staircase to find chaos masquerading as civilization. The table was set with the finest china and silver, but several pieces showed chips and dents that suggested previous meals had involved projectiles. The chandelier hung at a slight angle, and he noticed that one of the ancestral portraits now sported what appeared to be a small hole at eye level, perfectly round and suspiciously reminiscent of a bullet or perhaps a well-aimed marble. Eleanor Richardson stood at the head of the table like a general, surveying a battlefield she knew she was destined to lose. Her earlier desperation had been replaced by a grim determination that spoke of months of practice in maintaining dignity under fire. She had changed into a dinner dress of deep blue silk that might have been elegant, if not for the mysterious stains on one sleeve and what looked suspiciously like flower handprints across the skirt. "Mr. Hayes," she said with forced brightness as he entered the room, "I do hope your room is satisfactory." The children were eager to introduce themselves. "Indeed they were," Benjamin replied diplomatically, taking his seat at Eleanor's right hand, a position that he realized too late placed him directly in the line of fire between Margaret and Samuel. The children had arranged themselves with obvious strategic intent. Jonathan occupied the chair at the opposite end of the table from his mother, clearly claiming patriarchal authority over the household. Caroline sat to his right, her leather satchel positioned within easy reach and still emitting occasional wisps of smoke. Emma had positioned herself where she could observe everyone's facial expressions while maintaining an innocent appearance. Samuel bounced in his chair like a coiled spring, his pockets bulging with items that clinked ominously whenever he moved. Margaret sat with military precision, her back straight, and her eyes constantly scanning the table for potential opportunities or threats. Timothy, relegated to a chair with a cushion to bring him to proper height, swung his legs under the table with barely contained energy while conducting a whispered conversation with what appeared to be a small wooden horse. Mrs. Kowalski, Sturdy woman with iron grey hair and the resigned expression of someone who had learned to expect the worst, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tureen of soup. Her movements suggested long practice in dodging flying objects, and Benjamin noticed she kept her head down and moved quickly, like a soldier crossing open ground under enemy fire. "Tonight we're having cream of mushroom soup," Eleanor announced, with the determined cheerfulness of someone trying to maintain normal family traditions in abnormal circumstances. "Cook has outdone herself with the—" She was interrupted by a small explosion from Caroline's direction, followed by a puff of green smoke that made everyone's eyes water. Caroline waved the smoke away with scientific detachment while extracting a small, still smouldering device from her satchel. "My apologies," she said calmly, as if chemical reactions during dinner were perfectly normal. "I was testing the stability of a new compound, and apparently the ambient temperature in the dining room created unexpected volatility. The reaction should be completely neutralized in approximately 37 seconds. Eleanor closed her eyes and counted silently to 10 before responding. "Caroline, we've discussed your experiments at the dinner table. There are appropriate times and places for scientific pursuits." "Actually, Mother," Caroline replied, with the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow student, "scientific observation requires testing hypotheses under various environmental conditions. The dining room provides unique variables in terms of temperature, humidity, and social pressure that I cannot replicate in my laboratory." "Your laboratory?" Benjamin asked, genuinely curious, despite his growing alarm. "The root cellar," Samuel offered helpfully. "At least what's left of it after last Tuesday's incident with the sulfur compounds. Did you know that improper ventilation can turn a simple chemical reaction into what the fire marshal called a significant public safety hazard?" Mrs. Kowalski began ladling soup with movements that suggested she was timing her service to conclude before the next catastrophe struck. Benjamin accepted his bowl and was pleasantly surprised to find that the soup was actually quite good, assuming one could ignore the lingering taste of sulfur in the air. "So, Mr. Hayes," Jonathan said with casual authority, "Mother tells us you've taught in mining camps. Must have been rough work, dealing with miners' children. I imagine they weren't very sophisticated." The comment was clearly a test, designed to establish Benjamin's place in the household hierarchy. Jonathan was probing to see whether their new tutor would respond with defensive indignation or attempt to curry favor by agreeing with the implicit insult to his former students. "Actually," Benjamin replied evenly, "some of the most remarkable students I've ever taught were miners' children. Take young Billy Patterson. His father worked a claim outside Virginia City. Billy couldn't read when I first met him, but he had an intuitive understanding of geology that put most college graduates to shame. Within 6 months, he was teaching me about ore formations and mineral composition." He paused to take a spoonful of soup, letting his words sink in. Of course, Billy also had to learn quickly because survival in mining camps requires real skills. Children who waste time on elaborate pranks or attention-seeking behavior don't last long when there's actual work to be done. The comparison hit its mark. Benjamin could see Jonathan bristle at the implication that his current behavior was childish, compared to the maturity required of frontier children facing genuine hardships. Emma leaned forward with sweet interest. "How fascinating, Mr. Hayes. And what happened to this remarkable Billy Patterson? Did his practical education serve him well in later life?" The question was delivered with honeyed poison, clearly designed to expose some tragic outcome that would undermine Benjamin's point about the value of frontier education. "Last I heard, he'd been accepted to the Colorado School of Mines with a full scholarship," Benjamin replied calmly. His combination of practical experience and academic preparation made him exactly the sort of student they were seeking. "I believe he's now working as a mining engineer for one of the larger companies in Denver," Emma's smile faltered slightly. She hadn't expected her trap to backfire quite so thoroughly. "That's a lovely story," Margaret observed, with the tone of someone dismissing pleasant but irrelevant fiction. "But I think you'll find that our situation is rather different from frontier mining camps. We're not struggling for survival. We're simply maintaining our independence from adults who think they know what's best for us without understanding who we really are." "An excellent point," Benjamin agreed, surprising her. "You're absolutely right that your situation is different. You have advantages those mining camp children could never dream of: wealth, education, social position, a beautiful home, and a mother who loves you deeply. The question is, what are you doing with those advantages?" Margaret blinked, clearly not having expected him to agree with her premise. Billy Patterson used his advantages, a quick mind and determination, to build a better future for himself and eventually for his family, Benjamin continued. "What are you using yours for?" Before Margaret could respond, Samuel's fidgeting reached a crescendo that resulted in him accidentally knocking over his water glass while attempting to extract something from his pocket. The glass crashed to the floor, sending crystal fragments across the expensive Persian rug. "Samuel Alexander Richardson." Eleanor's voice carried genuine anger for the first time since Benjamin's arrival. "How many times have I told you not to bring your contraptions to the dinner table?" "It wasn't a contraption," Samuel protested, holding up a small mechanical device that appeared to be made from clock parts and bits of wire. "It's a timing mechanism for, well, I can't tell you what it's for, because that would ruin the surprise." "What kind of surprise?" Eleanor asked with the weary resignation of someone who had learned to fear her children's surprises. "The educational kind," Samuel replied with an innocent smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Mr. Hayes said we should use our talents for constructive purposes, so I'm constructing something that will help with his education." Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine. The boy's tone suggested that whatever he was planning would be memorable for all the wrong reasons. Mrs. Kowalski appeared with a dustpan to clean up the glass, moving with practiced efficiency while muttering what sounded like prayers in Polish. Timothy watched the clean-up operation with fascination, offering helpful commentary about the physics of falling objects until his mother suggested he focus on his soup instead. "Mr. Hayes," Emma said with renewed sweetness, "you've told us about your mining camp students, but you haven't mentioned why you left that position to come here. Did you find the work too challenging?" Another trap, this one designed to expose some failure or weakness that would undermine his authority. Benjamin recognized the tactic. Emma was a natural prosecutor, skilled at asking questions that seemed innocent but were designed to reveal uncomfortable truths. "I left," Benjamin said carefully, "because I received a letter from your mother, describing a family that needed help. After 10 years of teaching children who were fighting just to survive each day, the prospect of working with young people who had every advantage seemed like an opportunity to do something extraordinary." He set down his spoon and looked around the table, meeting each child's eyes in turn. "Children who don't have to worry about their next meal have the luxury of pursuing higher learning. Children who live in safe, comfortable homes can focus on developing their talents instead of simply staying alive. Children who have loving families can learn to build instead of merely defend. But you see," he continued, his voice growing more serious, "with great advantages come great responsibilities. The more you've been given, the more you're expected to give back. And right now, what you're giving back to your community, your family and yourselves, is chaos and disappointment." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft clinking of Mrs. Kowalski's serving spoons as she prepared to bring in the next course. Benjamin could feel the weight of 6 young minds, processing his words, trying to determine whether he was offering wisdom or manipulation. Caroline was the first to break the silence. "That's a rather simplistic analysis, Mr. Hayes. You're assuming that what you call chaos isn't actually a sophisticated response to adults who consistently underestimate our intelligence and autonomy. Perhaps what you interpret as misbehavior is actually a form of intellectual rebellion against a system that seeks to suppress our individual development in favor of social conformity. Benjamin nodded appreciatively. That's an excellent point, Caroline. You're clearly thinking about these issues on a sophisticated level. But let me ask you this. What specific aspects of your individual development are being enhanced by driving? Obey adults who want to teach you. What unique talents are you cultivating through elaborate pranks and explosive experiments that endanger your family's safety? Caroline opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again as she realized the logical trap he'd laid for her. Furthermore, Benjamin continued, if your goal is intellectual rebellion against inadequate educational systems, why not channel that rebellion into productive pursuits? Design better experiments that advance scientific knowledge. Write papers, challenging conventional thinking. Build inventions that solve real problems. Use your considerable intelligence to create something meaningful instead of merely destructive. Margaret leaned forward, her young face intense. And what if we don't? Want to fit into your definition of meaningful, Mr. Hayes? What if we're satisfied with our current way of life? Then you'll have wasted 6 extraordinary minds, Benjamin replied without hesitation. And in 10 years, when you look back on this time, you'll realize that you spent the most important developmental period of your lives playing elaborate games instead of becoming the remarkable adults you could have been. The weight of his words settled over the table like a blanket. These children were clearly accustomed to adults who either feared them or tried to control them through force. They weren't prepared for someone who challenged them intellectually, while respecting their intelligence. Timothy, who had been unusually quiet during the serious conversation, suddenly piped up with characteristic directness. Mr. Hayes, are you going to try to make us into different people, like the other tutors? Did? Benjamin turned to the youngest Richardson with genuine warmth. No, Timothy. I'm going to try to help you become more yourselves, the best versions of who you already are. The goal isn't to change your personalities, but to help you use your considerable talents in ways that make you proud instead of ashamed. We're not ashamed, Jonathan protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Aren't you? Benjamin asked quietly. Then why do you work so hard to keep visitors away? Why does your mother look exhausted and worried all the time? Why can't any of you bring friends home or attend social gatherings without fear of embarrassing your family? The questions hung in the air like accusations, impossible to dismiss because they struck at truths the children had been avoiding for months. Mrs. Kowalski returned with the main course, roasted beef with vegetables that looked delicious despite the lingering chemical tang in the air. As she served, Benjamin noticed that she moved with particular caution around Samuel's chair, clearly having learned from experience that proximity to the boy often resulted in unexpected hazards. The remainder of the meal passed in relative quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts. The children seemed to be processing Benjamin's challenges to their worldview, while Eleanor watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and anxiety, clearly uncertain whether her new employee was making progress or simply setting himself up for a more spectacular failure. As Mrs. Kowalski began clearing the dishes, Eleanor rose from her chair with obvious relief. Perhaps we should retire to the parlor for some quiet conversation before bedtime. Actually, Benjamin said, rising as well, I was hoping to discuss the daily schedule with the children. Tomorrow we'll be beginning a new routine, and I'd like everyone to understand what that will involve. The children exchanged glances that suggested they were finally ready to hear the terms of engagement for the war that was about to begin. Benjamin smiled, recognizing the look of intelligent adversaries preparing for battle. Tomorrow would bring The real test of whether his unconventional approach could succeed where others had failed, or whether the Richardson children would prove too formidable for even an experienced frontier teacher to handle. Benjamin's first night at Riverside Ranch proved that the Richardson children's reputation for creativity extended well beyond normal waking hours. He was awakened at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning by what sounded like a herd of stampeding, cattle thundering through the hallway outside his room. The noise was followed by hushed voices, muffled giggles, and what appeared to be the sound of furniture being strategically repositioned. When he investigated by opening his door, he found the hallway empty, except for a chair that had been placed directly in front of his room, a chair that hadn't been there when he'd retired for the evening. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that the chair was connected to an elaborate network of strings, pulleys, and what appeared to be Samuel's mechanical timing device from dinner. The entire contraption was designed to trigger some sort of chain reaction when disturbed. Rather than spring the trap, Benjamin simply stepped over the strings and made his way to the window at the end of the hall. The moonlight revealed Margaret and Timothy in the side yard below, apparently conducting some sort of military exercise involving precise movements between the garden beds and the chicken coop. Their coordination suggested hours of practice, and their evident enjoyment made it clear that this was recreation rather than mischief. Benjamin returned to his room, carefully avoiding the trap, and spent the remaining hours before dawn planning his strategy for the coming day. By the time the sun rose over the California hills, he had reached several important conclusions about his new charges and the methods that might prove effective in reaching them. First, the children were clearly operating as a coordinated unit, rather than 6 individuals. Their pranks showed evidence of careful planning and role specialization that would have impressed military strategists. Second, they were bored, desperately, chronically bored, and their elaborate schemes were as much about intellectual stimulation as they were about driving away unwanted adults. Third, and most importantly, they were testing him not just to see if he would give up, but to determine whether he was worthy of their respect. When Benjamin descended to breakfast at 7 o'clock sharp, he found the dining room transformed into what could only be described as a carefully orchestrated obstacle course. Strings had been stretched across doorways at ankle height, marbles had been strategically scattered across the polished floor, and several chairs had been repositioned to create narrow passages that would require careful navigation to avoid. Disaster! The children were already seated at the table, their expressions ranging from anticipation to barely suppressed glee. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, looking as though she was bracing for an explosion, while Mrs. Kowalski hovered near the kitchen door with the resigned expression of someone who had learned to expect property damage during morning meals. "Good morning, everyone," Benjamin announced cheerfully, surveying the booby-trapped room with obvious appreciation. "What an impressive engineering project. Samuel, I can see your mechanical expertise in the pulley system by the window. Margaret, the strategic placement of obstacles suggests your tactical planning. Caroline, those small piles of powder at various points are clearly designed to create visual or auditory effects when disturbed." The children's expressions shifted from anticipation to confusion. They had clearly expected him to stumble through. The obstacles trigger their traps and provide them with entertainment at his expense. Instead, he was complimenting their craftsmanship. "The coordination required for this level of complexity suggests you all worked together for several hours," Benjamin continued, carefully stepping over a particularly elaborate string configuration. "Jonathan, your leadership skills are evident in how well everyone understood their roles. Emma, the psychological aspect, creating an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty, shows your understanding of human nature. And Timothy, I suspect you were the scout who gathered intelligence about my room's location and the hallway layout." By the time he reached his chair, the children were staring at him with expressions that mixed frustration with reluctant admiration. He had not only avoided their traps, but had analyzed their methods with the appreciation of a fellow strategist. However, Benjamin said, settling into his seat with careful dignity, "I think we need to discuss the educational applications of your considerable talents." Jonathan found his voice first. Educational applications? Certainly. You've just demonstrated skills in engineering, tactical planning, chemistry, psychology, leadership, and reconnaissance. These are exactly the abilities that could make you extraordinarily successful adults if they were channeled into productive pursuits rather than elaborate pranks. Samuel bounced in his chair with excitement. "You mean we could use our trap-making skills for good instead of evil?" "Samuel," Benjamin replied with a smile, "I mean you could use your mechanical genius to design bridges, buildings, or inventions that help people instead of contraptions designed to embarrass your breakfast companions." Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, navigating the obstacle course with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to adapt to unusual circumstances. She set Benjamin's plate before him with a nod that might have contained approval, or possibly amazement that he had survived his first night without fleeing. "So," Emma said with deceptive sweetness, "you're proposing to redirect our creative energies toward more conventional pursuits. How very original. I'm sure no other tutor has ever suggested that we apply ourselves to traditional academic subjects." "Actually," Benjamin replied, cutting into his eggs with deliberate precision, "I'm proposing something quite different. Instead of traditional academic subjects, I'm suggesting we design our own curriculum based on your actual interests and abilities." The silence that followed was profound. Caroline lowered her fork and stared at him with scientific intensity. "Explain." "Well, Caroline, you're clearly fascinated by chemistry. Instead of forcing you to memorize poetry or practice penmanship, why don't we focus on advanced chemical principles? You could design experiments that contribute to actual scientific knowledge, instead of just creating impressive explosions." Caroline's eyes widened with possibilities she had clearly never considered. "Samuel," Benjamin continued, "your mechanical aptitude is remarkable. We could study engineering principles, design actual machines, maybe even work on improvements to ranch operations that could benefit your family's business." Samuel stopped bouncing and leaned forward with intense interest. "Margaret, your strategic thinking could be applied to business management, military history, or political science. Jonathan, your leadership abilities could be developed through real responsibilities, managing ranch operations, supervising workers, making decisions that actually matter." Jonathan's skeptical expression was beginning to soften, despite his obvious desire to remain hostile. "Emma, your understanding of human psychology could lead to studies in literature, diplomacy, or social sciences. You could learn to use your insights to help people instead of manipulating them." Emma's calculating smile faltered as she processed the implications of his suggestion. "And Timothy," Benjamin said, turning to the youngest, "your curiosity and energy could be channeled into exploration, natural sciences, or adventure-based learning that would make education feel like play rather than work." Timothy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "You mean we could learn things by doing them, instead of just reading about them in boring books?" "Exactly," Benjamin confirmed. "But here's the catch. This kind of education requires genuine commitment. You can't half-heartedly pursue advanced chemistry or mechanical engineering. These subjects demand discipline, focus, and the willingness to work hard even when the material becomes challenging." The children exchanged glances that suggested rapid internal communication. Benjamin could see them evaluating his proposal, trying to determine whether it was a trap designed to trick them into conventional behavior or a genuine offer of intellectual freedom. Margaret spoke first, her voice carefully neutral. "And what would you expect from us in return for this unconventional education?" "Three things," Benjamin replied without hesitation. "First, genuine effort. If we're going to pursue advanced subjects, you need to be willing to work harder than you've ever worked before. Second, respect for your mother and the household staff. Your pranks have made this house uncomfortable for everyone who lives here, and that needs to stop. Third, responsibility for your actions and their consequences." "What kind of responsibility?" Jonathan asked suspiciously. "If Caroline's experiments damage property, she repairs or replaces what she's broken. If Samuel's inventions malfunction and cause problems, he fixes whatever goes wrong. If your leadership decisions affect ranch operations, you deal with the results, good or bad." Benjamin paused to take a bite of bacon, letting his words sink in. "In other words, you'll be treated as the intelligent, capable young adults you clearly are, but you'll also be held accountable as intelligent, capable young adults." Emma leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "And if we decline your offer, if we prefer our current educational approach, then you'll have the same choice you've had for the past 18 months, Benjamin replied evenly. "You can continue playing elaborate games, driving away adults who want to help you, and wasting your considerable talents on pursuits that lead nowhere. I'll stay as long as your mother wants to pay my salary, but I won't participate in educational theater designed to maintain the illusion that learning is happening when it clearly isn't." The breakfast conversation was interrupted by a sudden mechanical clicking sound, followed by a series of small pops and the release of colored smoke from various points around the room. Samuel's timing device had finally activated, triggering the elaborate chain reaction they had prepared for Benjamin's morning humiliation. Instead of chaos, however, the result was rather anticlimactic. Strings released small banners that unfurled with messages like, "Welcome to your doom," and "Surrender now," while the colored smoke created rainbow patterns that were actually quite beautiful in the morning sunlight. Benjamin applauded appreciatively. "Outstanding work, everyone. The timing was perfect, the visual effects were spectacular, and the psychological impact was considerable. Now, if you put that same level of planning and execution into studying structural engineering, you could design bridges that span major rivers. If you applied it to chemistry, you could develop new medicines or materials that change the world." Caroline stared at him with something approaching awe. "You really think we're capable of that level of work?" "Caroline, you've already demonstrated that level of work. The question is whether you want to use it to impress breakfast guests or to contribute something meaningful to human knowledge." Mrs. Kowalski began clearing dishes with movements that suggested she was eager to escape before the next round of explosions began. As she worked, Benjamin noticed her watching the children's faces with what appeared to be cautious optimism. "I have a proposal," Margaret announced suddenly, her military bearing in full effect. "We'll agree to a trial period, 1 week of this unconventional education, to see whether it's genuinely different from previous attempts to manipulate us into compliance with conditions," Jonathan added quickly. "You have to prove that you can actually teach us things we don't already know, that you won't try to change our personalities, and that you understand we're not going to become obedient, conventional children just because you've offered us more interesting subjects." Benjamin nodded seriously. "Those seem like reasonable terms. I have one condition of my own." "What?" Emma asked suspiciously. "No more elaborate pranks designed to test my patience or drive me away. If you want to test my teaching abilities, do it through academic challenges. Ask me difficult questions, demand advanced material, push yourselves to learn things that seem impossible. Test my knowledge, not my tolerance for chaos." The children considered this for several moments, clearly weighing the appeal of intellectual Challenges against the entertainment value of traditional mischief. Finally, Timothy spoke up with characteristic directness. "Mr. Hayes, if we agree to try real learning for a week, and if we actually like it, what happens then?" "Then, Timothy, we keep going. We see how far your remarkable minds can take you when they're focused on building instead of tearing down." Samuel raised his hand as if he were in a formal classroom. "And if we don't like it, if we decide your way is just as boring as everyone else's, then I'll pack my bags and leave," Benjamin replied honestly. "But I'll also tell your mother that you're wasting gifts that could have made you extraordinary adults. And that breaks my heart because I've already seen how brilliant you all are." The silence that followed was different from previous pauses in their conversation. This one felt thoughtful rather than hostile, as if 6 young minds were seriously considering possibilities they had never imagined. "Very well," Margaret said, finally, speaking with the authority of someone making a command decision. "1 week, but we reserve the right to evaluate your methods and terminate the arrangement if you prove to be just another adult who thinks he knows what's best for us." "Agreed," Benjamin replied, extending his hand across the table. "Shall we shake on it?" One by one, the Richardson children shook hands with their new tutor, sealing an agreement that would either revolutionize their education or provide them with new and creative ways to demonstrate their resistance to adult authority. As they filed out of the dining room to begin their first day of unconventional learning, Benjamin remained at the table, wondering whether he had just made the wisest decision of his teaching career, or committed himself to the most spectacular failure in educational history. Either way, he thought with growing excitement it was going to be interesting. The morning after their agreement, Benjamin stood in the ranch's largest barn, surrounded by hay bales, farm equipment, and 6 skeptical faces that suggested the Richardson children were prepared to find his educational promises as hollow as those of their previous tutors. The setting itself was his first deviation from conventional teaching. Instead of a stuffy classroom with rigid desks and dusty blackboards, he had chosen a space that spoke of real work and practical applications. "Before we begin," Benjamin announced, pulling a piece of chalk from his pocket, "I want each of you to write one thing you've always wanted to learn, but were told was too advanced, too dangerous, or too impractical for someone your age." He handed the chalk to Caroline first, who approached the barn's weathered wall with scientific curiosity. Without hesitation, she wrote, "How to create compounds that could revolutionize medicine." Her handwriting was precise, confident, and utterly serious. Samuel bounded forward next, his enthusiasm evident as he scrawled, "How to build machines that could change the world." His letters were larger and less controlled than his sister's, reflecting his energetic personality. Margaret took the chalk with military precision and wrote in neat, efficient strokes, "How to run a business empire that could influence entire regions." Her ambition was breathtaking for a 10-year-old, but her expression suggested she was entirely serious. Emma approached with characteristic grace, her addition flowing in elegant script. "How to understand people so completely that I could write stories that change how they see themselves." The depth of her aspiration caught Benjamin off guard. This was far beyond manipulation or social games. Jonathan hesitated before writing, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he added, "How to lead people in ways that actually matter, not just giving orders that people follow out of obligation." The honesty of his self-doubt was striking. Timothy needed help reaching high enough to write, but his message was clear: how to explore places no one has ever been and discover things no one has ever seen. His sense of adventure was infectious, even written in his unsteady 8-year-old handwriting. Benjamin studied their responses with growing excitement. These weren't the shallow desires of spoiled children. They were the genuine aspirations of young people who had been forced to hide their intellectual hunger behind elaborate pranks and defensive behavior. "Excellent," he said finally. "Now I'm going to tell you something that no other tutor has probably ever said. Every single one of these goals is achievable, and we're going to start working toward them today." Caroline raised her hand with scientific skepticism. "Mr. Hayes, with all due respect, I'm 15 years old. Medical compounds require years of advanced chemistry study, access to laboratory equipment and—" "Caroline," Benjamin interrupted gently, "how much chemistry do you currently understand?" She blinked, considering the question. "I've read every chemistry text in Father's library, conducted hundreds of experiments, and successfully synthesized several complex compounds from basic materials." "So you've already begun the work," Benjamin pointed out. "The question isn't whether you're ready to create revolutionary medicines. It's whether you're ready to focus your existing skills on helping people instead of just impressing your family with explosions." Samuel jumped in excitedly. "You mean we're already capable of doing the things we wrote down?" "Not entirely," Benjamin replied honestly. "But you're much closer than you think. Samuel, show me your most complex mechanical creation." Without hesitation, Samuel raced to a corner of the barn where he had apparently been hiding various projects. He returned with a device that made Benjamin's breath catch, an intricate clockwork mechanism that appeared to be a working model of a steam engine, complete with moving pistons, rotating wheels, and a miniature boiler system. "Samuel," Benjamin said, examining the device with genuine awe, "this is remarkable. Where did you learn to create something this sophisticated?" "I took apart Father's pocket watch, the big clock in the parlor, and Mrs. Kowalski's mechanical egg beater," Samuel explained proudly. "Then I studied how all the pieces worked and tried to combine the principles into something new." "You reverse-engineered complex mechanisms and then innovated original designs," Benjamin translated. "Samuel, that's exactly what professional engineers do. The only difference is that they work on larger scales with more resources." Margaret stepped forward with tactical directness. "Mr. Hayes, you're suggesting that our current abilities are foundation for advanced study, but every previous tutor has told us we need to master basic subjects before attempting anything interesting. How do we know you're not simply using different words to trick us into conventional education?" "Because, Margaret, we're going to prove it," Benjamin replied. "Today, right now, each of you is going to tackle a real problem that requires the skills you want to develop, and we'll see what happens when your intelligence is focused on something that actually matters." He moved to the center of the barn, his excitement building, as he outlined his plan. "Caroline, there's been an outbreak of influenza in the town. The local doctor is overwhelmed, and people are suffering from symptoms that existing medicines aren't effectively treating. Your challenge is to research the disease, analyze the available remedies, and propose improvements based on your chemical knowledge." Caroline's eyes widened with possibilities and terror in equal measure. "But what if I make mistakes? What if my suggestions are wrong?" "Then you'll learn from the mistakes and try again," Benjamin replied simply. "That's how real scientists work, through experimentation, failure, analysis, and improvement. The difference is that your work will be contributing to actual human welfare instead of just testing how much damage you can do to the root cellar." He turned to Samuel next. "The ranch's irrigation system is inefficient and wastes enormous amounts of water during dry seasons. Your challenge is to design mechanical improvements that could increase efficiency and reduce waste. If your innovations work, they could be implemented across the entire region." Samuel's face lit up with the intensity of someone who had just discovered his life's purpose. Real engineering work that could help actual farmers. "Exactly," Benjamin confirmed. "Margaret, the ranch's business operations are managed by different foremen who don't always coordinate effectively. Your challenge is to analyze the current system, identify inefficiencies, and propose management strategies that could increase profitability while improving working conditions. Margaret straightened to her full height, her military bearing more pronounced than ever. You want me to study actual business operations with real financial data? I want you to apply your strategic thinking to problems that matter, Benjamin replied. Emma, there are several families in town who have been struggling since the drought damaged their crops. Their children are becoming isolated and discouraged. Your challenge is to understand their psychological needs and create programs. Maybe through storytelling, community events, or social initiatives that could help them reconnect with hope and community. Emma's calculating smile had disappeared entirely, replaced by something Benjamin had never seen before: genuine emotional engagement. You want me to use psychology to help people instead of manipulating them? I want you to discover what your insights into human nature can accomplish when they're directed toward healing instead of control, Benjamin said. He moved to Jonathan, whose skeptical expression was beginning to crack. Jonathan, you're 17 years old and the eldest son of a family business. Instead of pretending to learn leadership from textbooks, you're going to take actual responsibility for coordinating all of these projects. Your siblings' work will succeed or fail, partly based on your ability to help them work together effectively. Jonathan's throat worked silently for several moments before he found his voice. You're asking me to actually lead, not just give orders. I'm asking you to discover what kind of leader you want to become, Benjamin replied. Finally, he knelt beside Timothy, bringing himself to the 8-year-old's eye level. Timothy, your job is the most important of all. You're going to explore the ranch and the surrounding area, mapping resources, identifying opportunities, and discovering things that everyone else has overlooked. Your adventures will provide the raw material that your siblings need for their projects. Timothy's eyes sparkled with delight. I get to be an explorer, a real one. The most important kind, Benjamin confirmed, the kind whose discoveries help other people solve problems. Eleanor Richardson, who had been watching from the barn doorway, stepped forward with an expression of cautious amazement. Mr. Hayes, are you certain this approach is safe? These projects sound quite advanced for children, Mrs. Richardson, Benjamin replied, turning to face her. Your children have been conducting advanced chemistry experiments, building complex mechanical devices, and orchestrating sophisticated strategic operations for months. The only difference is that now their considerable abilities will be directed toward helping people instead of terrorizing house guests. Caroline raised her hand with scientific precision. Mr. Hayes, how will we know if we're succeeding? What are the criteria for evaluation? Excellent question, Benjamin replied. Your success will be measured by real-world results. Caroline, if your research leads to treatments that help sick people recover faster, you'll know you're succeeding. Samuel, if your irrigation improvements actually conserve water and increase crop yields, your engineering work is successful. He looked around the group, meeting each child's eyes. But here's the most important part. You'll also be evaluated on how well you work together. These projects are interconnected. Caroline's medical research might require Samuel's mechanical skills to create new delivery systems. Margaret's business analysis might identify resources that Timothy discovers during his explorations. Emma's psychological insights might help all of you communicate more effectively with the people you're trying to help. Margaret frowned thoughtfully. You're saying that individual excellence isn't enough. We need collaborative excellence. I'm saying that the greatest achievements in human history have come from brilliant people who learned to combine their talents with other brilliant people, Benjamin replied. Your father built this ranch not just through his own efforts, but by inspiring others to work toward shared goals. The reference to their father created a moment of profound silence. Benjamin could see the children processing not just his educational proposals, but the deeper implication that he understood their grief and wanted to honor their father's memory through meaningful work. Samuel broke the silence with characteristic directness. "When do we start?" "Right now," Benjamin replied, pulling several books from a satchel he had brought to the barn. "Caroline, these are medical texts that belong to the town doctor." "Samuel, here are engineering manuals from the Territorial College." "Margaret, these are business ledgers and financial records that your mother has agreed to share." He distributed materials with the efficiency of someone who had spent considerable time planning this moment. "Emma, I've arranged for you to interview several families about their experiences during the drought. Timothy, I have maps of the region that include geological surveys and resource assessments." Jonathan stepped forward, his expression serious. "And my materials." "You don't get books, Jonathan," Benjamin replied. "You get the hardest job of all, figuring out how to coordinate 5 brilliant, strong-willed siblings who have spent the last 18 months perfecting the art of chaos. Your leadership training starts with managing the most challenging team you'll ever encounter." Jonathan's laugh was rueful, but genuine. "You certainly don't make things easy, do you, Mr. Hayes?" "Easy doesn't build character," Benjamin replied. "Easy doesn't create the kind of people who change the world. Easy doesn't honor the memory of a father who raised 6 extraordinary children." As the children scattered to examine their new materials, Benjamin felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. He had just committed himself to an educational experiment that was either brilliantly innovative or spectacularly reckless. These children had the intelligence and creativity to achieve remarkable things, but they also had the capacity to turn his unconventional methods into chaos that would make their previous pranks seem trivial. Mrs. Kowalski appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a tray of sandwiches and milk. "Thought you might need sustenance for all this learning," she said, her tone suggesting cautious approval mixed with concern for everyone's safety. As the children gathered around the food, chattering excitedly about their new projects, Benjamin noticed something he had never seen before: genuine enthusiasm for learning. For the first time since his arrival, they looked like the bright, curious young people they had always been beneath their defensive behavior. The real test would come in the following days, when initial excitement gave way to the hard work of turning ambitious goals into actual achievements. But for now, Benjamin allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The Richardson children were finally ready to discover what they could accomplish when their considerable talents were focused on building instead of tearing down. 3 days into their educational experiment, the Richardson children discovered that good intentions and natural intelligence were not sufficient to overcome the complexities of real-world problem-solving. Benjamin found Caroline in tears in the root cellar, surrounded by broken glass, scattered chemical powders, and the acrid smell of failed experiments. "It doesn't work," she sobbed, her usual scientific composure completely shattered. "None of it works. I've tried 17 different combinations based on the medical texts, and every single mixture either does nothing or makes the symptoms worse. Mrs. Patterson's fever actually increased after she took my first attempt, and little Billy Thompson broke out in hives from the second one." Benjamin surveyed the chaos that had once been Caroline's organized laboratory. Test tubes lay shattered on the wooden tables, chemical stains covered every surface, and her normally precise handwriting had devolved into frustrated scrawls across pages of calculations. The young woman who had confidently created explosions for entertainment was discovering that purposeful chemistry was infinitely more difficult than destructive experimentation. "Tell me about your methodology," Benjamin said quietly, settling on an overturned crate beside her work table. Methodology? Caroline laughed bitterly. I read about compounds that were supposed to reduce fever and inflammation, mixed them in proportions that seemed logical, and tested them on willing volunteers. That's not methodology. That's guesswork disguised as science. Actually, Benjamin replied, that's exactly how most medical breakthroughs begin. The problem isn't your approach, it's your expectation that you should achieve professional results without professional training. Caroline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the chemical residue on her face. You said I was capable of revolutionary medicine. You said my skills were foundation enough to start meaningful work. I said your skills were foundation enough to begin learning, Benjamin corrected gently. Caroline, you've discovered more about practical chemistry in 3 days than most students learn in months of textbook study. The fact that your experiments are failing means you're attempting work that's genuinely challenging. From the barn, above them came the sound of mechanical clanging, followed by Samuel's voice raised in creative profanity that would have impressed the roughest miners Benjamin had ever taught. The irrigation project was clearly not proceeding smoothly either. Caroline followed Benjamin's gaze toward the ceiling. Samuel's having as much trouble as I am. His first irrigation prototype flooded half the east pasture, and his second one broke apart during the first windstorm. Jonathan spent yesterday helping the ranch hands repair damage that Samuel's engineering improvements caused to the existing system. And how is Jonathan handling his leadership responsibilities? Benjamin asked, though the increasingly frequent arguments echoing through the house suggested he could guess the answer. He's trying, Caroline admitted reluctantly, but coordinating 5 siblings who are all frustrated with their projects while dealing with his own perfectionist tendencies. Yesterday, he locked himself in Father's study and wouldn't come out until Mother threatened to have the door removed. From its hinges, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Margaret appeared at the top of the root cellar stairs, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of prolonged stress. Her hair had escaped from its military-precise braid. Her dress bore ink stains from financial calculations, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had been staring at incomprehensible numbers for days without rest. "Mr. Hayes," she announced with characteristic directness, "I need to report complete strategic failure. The ranch's financial records are significantly more complex than I anticipated, and my analysis has revealed problems that I have no idea how to solve." She descended the stairs with movements that reflected emotional exhaustion rather than her usual confident bearing. "According to my calculations, the ranch is operating at a loss despite appearing prosperous. There are debts that aren't listed in the primary ledgers, contracts with unfavorable terms that are locked in for years, and operational inefficiencies that are costing thousands of dollars annually." Benjamin felt his stomach sink. "Margaret, are you certain about these calculations?" "I've checked them 17 times, she replied, producing pages covered with meticulous figures. "Mr. Hayes, my mother doesn't know how precarious our financial situation actually is. The ranch hands are being paid above market rates, which is admirable but unsustainable. The cattle contracts are structured to benefit buyers rather than sellers, and there are outstanding loans that will come due within 2 years. Caroline stared at her sister with growing alarm. "You're saying we might lose the ranch?" "I'm saying that without significant changes to business operations, the ranch will be insolvent within 18 months, Margaret replied with brutal honesty. "My strategic analysis has revealed that our family's financial security is largely an illusion maintained by spending inherited capital rather than generating sustainable income." The implications of Margaret's discoveries settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. Benjamin realized that his educational experiment had inadvertently uncovered a crisis that went far beyond academic challenges. The Richardson family's entire way of life was potentially at risk. "Does your mother know about any of this?" Benjamin asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "I don't think so. The financial records were organized to obscure problems rather than reveal them. Father may have been protecting her from worrying about business details, or he may have been planning changes that his death prevented him from implementing." Emma's voice drifted down from the barn above, raised in an argument with someone, probably Timothy, based on the higher-pitched responses. Their community psychology project was evidently facing its own complications. "I should check on the others," Benjamin said, rising from his makeshift seat. "Caroline, I want you to focus on documenting your experimental failures rather than trying to achieve immediate success. Scientific progress is built on understanding what doesn't work as much as discovering what does." "And my financial analysis?" Margaret asked. "Should I continue investigating our family's business problems, or would it be better to pretend I never discovered them?" Benjamin considered the question seriously. These children had asked for real-world challenges, and Margaret had uncovered the most serious real-world challenge their family faced. Protecting them from difficult truths would undermine everything he had tried to teach them about meaningful education. "Continue your analysis," he decided, "but we'll need to discuss how and when to share your findings with your mother. This kind of information requires careful handling." In the barn, Benjamin found Samuel surrounded by the wreckage of his latest irrigation prototype, while Timothy sat cross-legged nearby, drawing detailed maps of the ranch's water sources. Emma paced back and forth between them, her usual composure replaced by frustrated energy. "Mr. Hayes," Samuel called out as soon as he spotted his tutor, "I've designed 14 different irrigation improvements, and every single one has failed spectacularly. Either they don't work at all, or they work too well and flood everything, or they break apart the first time there's any stress on the system." Benjamin examined the scattered pieces of Samuel's latest attempt, gears, pipes, and mechanical components that had clearly been assembled with considerable skill but inadequate understanding of hydraulic engineering principles. "Samuel, show me your design process," Benjamin requested. "How do you decide what to build?" "I look at the problem, imagine a solution, and build it," Samuel replied, as if the answer were obvious. "That's how I've always created things. And that approach worked for your personal projects because the consequences of failure were minimal," Benjamin observed. "But irrigation systems need to function reliably under varying conditions, withstand weather and mechanical stress, and integrate with existing infrastructure. Your imagination needs to be supplemented by engineering principles that account for real-world variables." Emma stopped pacing and faced Benjamin directly. "Mr. Hayes, I've interviewed 6 families about their experiences during the drought, and what I've discovered is that their problems can't be solved through community events or storytelling programs. These people are facing genuine hardships, failed crops, unpaid debts, children who are hungry and frightened about their families' futures." Her voice carried a weight that hadn't been present during her earlier manipulative conversations. "I'd thought I understood human psychology, but I've been studying people as intellectual puzzles rather than as individuals with real pain and real needs. Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that her family might lose their farm, and she started crying right there in front of me. I had no idea what to do." Timothy looked up from his maps with 8-year-old directness. "Emma, maybe that's the point. Maybe understanding people means learning to care about their feelings instead of just figuring out how to influence them." The observation was so perceptive that it left Emma speechless. Benjamin realized that Timothy's exploration project was providing more than geographical information. The youngest Richardson was discovering insights about human nature that his older siblings had missed. "Timothy, tell me about your exploration." "Discoveries," Benjamin requested, settling beside the boy's carefully drawn maps. "Well," Timothy began with the enthusiasm of someone finally being asked to share important work. I found 3 natural springs that aren't being used for anything, a deposit of clay that Mrs. Kowalski says would be perfect for making pottery, and a section of the North Pasture where the soil is different from everywhere else. He pointed to various locations on his map with the pride of a professional cartographer. But the most interesting thing is that I found evidence that other people used to live on our land. Old foundations, pieces of pottery, even some metal. Tools that are buried under years of dirt. Benjamin studied Timothy's discoveries with growing excitement. Timothy, these findings could be crucial for your siblings' projects. The springs could solve Samuel's irrigation challenges, the clay deposits could provide materials for Caroline's experiments, and the historical artifacts might reveal traditional methods that could improve ranch operations. Samuel's head snapped up from his mechanical debris. Natural springs. Timothy, why didn't you tell me about water sources before I spent 3 days trying to engineer complex pumping systems? You were too busy being frustrated to ask what I'd found, Timothy replied, with matter-of-fact honesty that made Samuel wince. This is exactly what I was talking about, Emma said with dawning understanding. I've been so focused on my individual project that I haven't been listening to what everyone else is discovering. We're working in isolation instead of collaboration. From the doorway came Jonathan's voice, strained but determined. That's my fault. I've been so worried about my own performance as a leader that I forgot to actually facilitate communication between everyone's projects. Jonathan entered the barn, looking like someone who had wrestled with difficult realizations and emerged with new perspective. I've spent the last 2 days reading about leadership and management, and I discovered that effective coordination requires understanding what everyone is working on, identifying connections between different projects, and creating systems that allow people to share information easily. He moved to the center of the group with renewed confidence. I think we need to restart this entire experiment, but this time as a genuine team rather than as individuals pursuing separate goals. Benjamin felt a surge of pride as he watched the children process their failures and begin to understand the deeper lessons embedded in their struggles. Jonathan, what do you propose? Daily coordination meetings where everyone shares their progress, challenges, and discoveries, Jonathan replied immediately. Shared resource allocation so that Timothy's explorations inform Samuel's engineering, and Caroline's chemistry. Strategic planning sessions where Margaret's business analysis guides our project priorities. Margaret nodded approvingly. And Emma's psychological insights could help us understand how to present our eventual solutions in ways that people will actually accept and use. Caroline wiped her hands on her apron and straightened her shoulders with renewed determination. Mr. Hayes, I request permission to start over with my medical research, but this time using proper scientific methodology and collaboration with my siblings' discoveries. Permission granted, Benjamin replied with a smile. But Caroline, I want you to understand that your failures over the past 3 days weren't wasted time. They were essential learning experiences that taught you more about real chemistry than years of textbook study could have accomplished. Samuel began gathering the pieces of his broken irrigation prototype with new energy. And I need to study actual engineering principles instead of relying on intuition and hoping for the best. The difference, Benjamin said, watching his students transform their frustration into renewed determination, is that now you understand why those principles matter. You've discovered that meaningful work requires more than natural talent. It demands discipline, collaboration, and the willingness to learn from failure. As the children began organizing their materials and planning their collaborative approach, Benjamin realized that the past 3 days of apparent failure had actually been the most successful educational experience of his career. The Richardson children had learned lessons that no textbook could have taught them, lessons about humility, teamwork, and the difference between entertaining themselves and contributing to something larger than their individual desires. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time since his arrival, Benjamin was confident that these remarkable young people were ready to tackle challenges worthy of their considerable abilities. 2 weeks after their collaborative restart, the Richardson children had transformed from a collection of brilliant individuals into a formidable team whose combined efforts were producing results that astonished everyone, including Benjamin. The morning coordination meetings that Jonathan had proposed had evolved into dynamic strategy sessions where each child's discoveries amplified the other's work in ways that none of them had anticipated. In Caroline's reconstructed laboratory, the acrid smell of failed experiments had been replaced by the organized efficiency of systematic research. Timothy's discovery of natural clay deposits had provided her with materials for creating specialized containers that didn't react with her chemical compounds. Samuel's engineering expertise had helped her design a filtration system that purified her mixtures more effectively than any equipment described in the medical texts. Most importantly, Emma's interviews with sick families had given Caroline crucial information about how different symptoms responded to various treatments. "Mr. Hayes," Caroline announced during their morning meeting in the barn, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who had made a genuine breakthrough. "I believe we've created something significant." She held up a small glass vial, containing a clear liquid that looked deceptively simple. "It's a fever-reducing compound based on willow bark extracts, but modified using traditional methods that Timothy discovered from those historical artifacts. Mrs. Patterson's temperature dropped 2 degrees within an hour of taking it, and she reported feeling better than she had in weeks." Benjamin examined the vial with appropriate seriousness. "Caroline, have you tested this on other patients? What about side effects?" "That's where Emma's work becomes crucial," Caroline replied, gesturing to her sister. "She's been tracking not just the physical symptoms, but the psychological impact of illness on families. Her observations help me understand that effective medicine needs to address both physical discomfort and the anxiety that comes from feeling helpless." Emma stepped forward with notebooks filled with detailed observations about each family she had interviewed. "Mr. Hayes, I've discovered that healing involves much more than just treating symptoms. The families who recover fastest are those who feel hopeful and supported. Caroline's medicine works better when it's combined with what I call psychological medicine, helping people understand their illness, giving them confidence in their treatment, and connecting them with community support." Samuel bounced with excitement as he added his contribution to their medical breakthrough. "And I've designed a delivery system that makes Caroline's medicine more effective. It's a mechanical device that measures exact doses and can be operated by people who can't read, which includes most of the families we're trying to help." He produced a compact wooden box with brass fittings that opened to reveal a series of graduated chambers and a simple lever mechanism. "Timothy's maps showed me which families lived too far from town to visit the doctor regularly, so I designed this to be portable and foolproof. Even children can operate it safely." Margaret approached with her financial ledgers, but her expression was troubled rather than triumphant. "The medical project is achieving remarkable results, but we need to discuss the larger implications of what we're discovering. My business analysis has revealed problems that extend far beyond our family's ranch." She opened her most recent calculations with the precision of someone delivering military intelligence. "Mr. Hayes, the economic difficulties affecting our neighbors aren't isolated cases. They're part of a regional pattern that suggests systemic problems with how agricultural communities are structured financially." Benjamin felt a familiar chill as Margaret continued her analysis. The 10-year-old's strategic mind had clearly uncovered complexities that adult business leaders might have missed. The drought was devastating, but it exposed weaknesses that already existed, Margaret explained. Farmers throughout the region are trapped in debt cycles that make them vulnerable to any disruption in crop yields. Banks are foreclosing on properties that have been family-owned for generations, and our own ranch's prosperity was largely dependent on cattle contracts that are being terminated as buyers seek cheaper sources. Jonathan stepped forward with the authority of someone who had learned to coordinate complex information from multiple sources. Margaret's analysis indicates that our individual family problems are connected to broader economic challenges that require community-wide solutions. We can't solve our ranch's financial difficulties without addressing the region's agricultural crisis. Timothy, who had been quietly drawing in his notebook throughout the discussion, suddenly looked up with the clarity that often comes from 8-year-old perspectives. So we need to help other families solve their problems in order to solve our own problems? Exactly, Benjamin replied, impressed by Timothy's intuitive understanding of interconnected systems. But that's an enormous challenge. How do you propose to tackle economic problems that affect an entire region? Emma raised her hand with the confidence of someone who had discovered her true calling. Mr. Hayes, what if we treat the economic crisis as a community psychology problem? During my interviews, I've noticed that many families are making decisions based on fear and isolation rather than accurate information about their options. She pulled out her most recent notes, pages filled with observations about human behavior. Under stress, people are selling livestock at below-market prices because they're afraid of being unable to feed them through winter. They're accepting unfavorable contracts because they don't realize they have alternatives. They're competing with neighboring families instead of cooperating, which weakens everyone's position. Caroline nodded enthusiastically. Emma's observations suggest that our medical project could be expanded into what we might call community medicine, treating the social and economic symptoms that make families vulnerable to physical illness. Samuel's mechanical mind immediately grasped the implications. We could design systems that help families share resources more efficiently, irrigation networks that serve multiple properties, equipment that can be shared between farms, storage, facilities that reduce waste across the entire region. Margaret's strategic thinking was already racing ahead to implementation details, and I could analyze the financial structures that are creating these debt cycles, then propose alternative arrangements that benefit producers rather than just buyers and lenders. Benjamin stared at his students with a mixture of pride and awe. In 2 weeks of collaborative work, they had evolved from children playing elaborate pranks into young people tackling problems that challenged experienced professionals. Their combination of intellectual capabilities was producing insights that none of them could have achieved individually. What you're describing, he said slowly, is essentially redesigning the economic foundations of your entire community. Do you understand the scope of what you're proposing? Jonathan answered with the calm confidence of someone who had discovered his capacity for real leadership. Mr. Hayes, we understand that it's ambitious, but we also understand that our family's survival depends on our community's success. We can't solve our problems in isolation any more than we could succeed in our individual projects without collaboration. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and the jangle of harnesses that suggested multiple riders. Through the barn's open doors, Benjamin could see a group of well-dressed men on horseback approaching the main house, the kind of formal delegation that usually brought either very good news or very bad news. Eleanor Richardson's voice carried across the yard as she emerged from the house to greet the visitors. Even at a distance, Benjamin could hear the strain in her tone as she exchanged greetings with what appeared to be a group of bankers or business associates. Margaret immediately moved to the barn's doorway for a better view, her strategic instincts activated by the arrival of potential threats. "Mr. Hayes, those men are from the Central Valley Bank and the Riverside Cattle Company, the institutions that hold our most significant debts and contracts." Caroline joined her sister at the doorway, her scientific mind focused on gathering observational data. Mother looked surprised to see them. This wasn't a scheduled meeting. Emma's psychological insights proved immediately relevant as she watched the interaction between Eleanor and her unexpected visitors. Mother's body language suggests she's receiving information that she wasn't prepared for. She's trying to maintain composure, but she's clearly being presented with some sort of ultimatum or demand. Samuel had abandoned his mechanical projects and was bouncing with nervous energy. "Should we go help Mother? She looks like she needs support." "No," Jonathan said firmly, his leadership training asserting itself. "Mother has always handled business meetings independently. Our interference would undermine her authority. But we should be prepared to provide whatever assistance she requests afterward." Timothy, with characteristic directness, asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Are those men here because of the money problems Margaret discovered?" Margaret's face had gone pale as she watched the increasingly tense conversation taking place near the house. "I think so. The timing suggests that our creditors have decided to accelerate their collection schedules. If Mother wasn't aware of the full extent of our financial difficulties, she's learning about them right now." Through the barn's doorway, they could see Eleanor's posture growing more rigid as the conversation continued. One of the visitors was gesturing toward the ranch buildings with movements that suggested he was itemizing valuable assets. Another was consulting documents that appeared to be legal papers. "Mr. Hayes," Caroline said quietly, "I think we're about to discover whether our educational experiment can survive a real crisis." Benjamin felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The Richardson children had transformed into capable young people who were tackling complex problems with intelligence and maturity. But their collaborative projects and breakthrough discoveries might be rendered irrelevant if their family lost the ranch that provided the foundation for their work. "What are our options?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her expression. Margaret answered with the strategic clarity that had become her trademark. "We accelerate our community-wide solutions and hope that our innovations can generate enough economic value to satisfy our creditors. Or we prepare for the possibility that our family will need to start over somewhere else with nothing but our abilities and whatever knowledge we've gained." Jonathan stepped forward with determination that reminded Benjamin powerfully of the boy's late father. "There's a third option. We present our community development plans to those bankers and demonstrate that supporting our innovations serves their long-term interests better than foreclosing on properties that have limited value, without the people who know how to work them productively." The audacity of Jonathan's proposal took Benjamin's breath away. The 17-year-old was suggesting that children should negotiate with professional bankers using economic development plans that they had conceived during what was supposed to be educational experimentation. "Jonathan," Benjamin said carefully, "that's an extraordinarily ambitious proposal. Are you confident that your collaborative projects have produced results sophisticated enough to convince experienced businessmen?" "Only one way to find out," Samuel replied, with the fearless optimism that had driven all his mechanical innovations. Caroline held up her medical compounds with scientific precision. "We have documented evidence that our innovations work. The question is whether we can communicate their value effectively enough to change adult decision-making." Emma's psychological insights were already focused on the challenge ahead. We need to understand what those bankers actually want, which might not be the same as what they're saying they want. Timothy looked up from his maps with 8-year-old wisdom that consistently surprised everyone. Maybe they want to feel important and smart. Maybe if we ask for their help, instead of trying to convince them we don't need them, they'll be more interested in listening. The observation was so perceptive that it left the entire group silent for several moments. From the main house came the sound of the front door closing with finality that suggested the business meeting had concluded. Eleanor Richardson stood, alone in the yard, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion and worry. "Time to find out what we're really facing," Margaret said with military determination. As the children filed out of the barn to support their mother, Benjamin realized that their educational experiment was about to face its ultimate test. Not whether they could learn to work together, but whether their collaborative abilities could save their family when everything they cared about was at stake. Eleanor Richardson stood in her front parlor, like a general surveying the aftermath of a lost battle, holding legal documents that spelled out the end of everything her late husband had built. The children gathered around her in a protective semicircle, their earlier excitement about collaborative projects replaced by grim reality. "They're calling in all our loans," Eleanor announced, her voice trembling. "We have 60 days to pay, $47,000, or they'll foreclose on the ranch." Mr. Hartwell made it clear they're systematically consolidating land ownership for industrial farming operations. The sum was staggering. Margaret's financial calculations had been conservative. The actual situation was even worse than her analysis had suggested. Timothy, with 8-year-old clarity, suddenly spoke up. "Mother, what if we could show them that our way of farming makes more money than their way?" Benjamin felt his heart leap as he recognized the profound wisdom in Timothy's innocent question. Timothy's right. What if your collaborative projects aren't just educational experiments? What if they're the foundation for a new kind of agricultural community that's more profitable than industrial farming? Margaret immediately pulled out her financial ledgers. If our innovations could demonstrate superior economic returns, we might convince investors to support family-owned operations instead of corporate consolidation. "We need proof," Jonathan pointed out with practical leadership skills. "Actual results, not just theoretical projections." Caroline held up her medical compounds with renewed determination. "We have proof. Mrs. Patterson recovered faster using my treatments than conventional medicines. If we scale up production, medical applications alone could generate significant revenue." Samuel gestured toward his irrigation prototypes excitedly. "My water conservation systems increased crop yields by 30% while using half the water. Implemented across multiple farms, the efficiency gains would be enormous." Emma focused on the human elements. "Success requires convincing people to work together instead of competing. The families I've interviewed struggle partly because they're isolated and suspicious of cooperation." Margaret nodded approvingly. Coordinated resource sharing would give family farms the advantages corporations achieve through scale without surrendering land ownership. Benjamin stared at his students with realization that their educational experiment had evolved into something unprecedented. Children had developed a comprehensive economic development plan that could revolutionize agricultural communities. "What you're describing is a complete reimagining of rural economic organization," he said slowly. "But those bankers expect payment in 60 days, not 60 months. Jonathan stepped forward with confidence. "Mother, what if we propose a partnership instead of payment? What if we demonstrate that supporting our innovations serves their interests better than foreclosing?" The next 2 weeks became the most intensive work period of their lives. Caroline established a laboratory in the parlor, preparing medical compound samples with documentation that would impress university researchers. Samuel converted the dining room into a workshop, assembling irrigation models that demonstrated water conservation and yield improvement. Margaret transformed the study into a command center where financial projections and regional maps revealed opportunities no adult had recognized. Emma compiled interviews with dozens of families, creating community analysis crucial for implementing change. Jonathan coordinated everyone's contributions into a coherent presentation strategy. Timothy provided maps and historical discoveries that strengthened their arguments with evidence that the ranch had been successfully farmed for generations using sustainable methods. When the bankers returned, Eleanor was prepared. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my family's development team and review their proposals for agricultural innovation." The three investors, Mr. Hartwell from Central Valley Bank, Mr. Stevenson from Riverside Cattle Company, and Mr. Morrison, representing the Development Consortium, initially appeared to be humoring a desperate woman attempting to delay foreclosure. Caroline began in her laboratory, demonstrating medical compounds with scientific precision that immediately captured attention. "Miss Richardson," Mr. Hartwell said with surprise, "these pharmaceutical applications suggest significant commercial potential." Samuel's irrigation demonstrations proved equally impressive, showing improvements that translated directly into increased profitability. These water management innovations could revolutionize farming throughout California, Mr. Stevenson observed. Margaret's financial presentation revealed analysis exceeding professional consulting firms. "Your economic projections challenge fundamental assumptions about agricultural development," Mr. Morrison admitted with amazement. Emma's community psychology research provided social context that transformed individual innovations into comprehensive regional strategy. Jonathan's coordination demonstrated executive leadership potential that impressed the businessman. Timothy's historical discoveries proved that traditional techniques could be enhanced rather than replaced by technological innovation. By presentation's end, the investors were discussing implementation possibilities rather than foreclosure procedures. The Richardson children had successfully reframed their family's crisis as an investment opportunity. "Mrs. Richardson," Mr. Hartwell announced after consultation, "we'd like to propose a partnership arrangement supporting your innovations while providing our consortium access to development methods superior to our original strategies." The partnership terms were generous: restructured debt as development loans, modified contracts reflecting improved efficiency, and investment in infrastructure supporting family farm cooperation. Most importantly, the Richardson family retained ranch ownership while receiving resources to expand innovations region-wide. 6 months later, Riverside Ranch had become the center of an agricultural innovation network, transforming farming communities. Throughout California, Caroline's medical compounds were being produced cooperatively and distributed across the region. Samuel's irrigation systems were conserving thousands of gallons while increasing yields throughout the valley. Margaret's economic cooperation models were being studied by agricultural colleges as sustainable community development examples. Emma had established programs helping farming families coordinate resources and support each other. Jonathan managed a regional council of young farmers implementing innovative approaches. Timothy's discoveries led to historical preservation programs, honoring traditional wisdom while embracing beneficial changes. Benjamin remained at Riverside Ranch, not as a tutor controlling difficult children, but as an educational coordinator, helping brilliant young people expand their innovations to benefit entire communities. His mail-order arrangement with Eleanor had evolved into genuine partnership based on shared commitment to family and community development. On quiet evenings, Benjamin often reflected on how completely wrong his initial expectations had been. He had sought security and conventional domestic harmony. Instead, he discovered that true happiness came from working together toward goals extending far beyond individual comfort. The Richardson children had taught him that meaningful education happened when learning connected to genuine service. That the strongest families used combined talents to benefit communities, and that the greatest adventures were found not in escaping responsibility, but embracing impossible challenges. As he watched Timothy drawing maps while his siblings planned world-changing innovations, Benjamin realized his own transformation had been as dramatic as theirs. He had arrived seeking quiet stability and discovered his true calling was nurturing young people whose collaborative genius could revolutionize everything they touched. The mail-order groom who expected to tame 6 wild children had instead witnessed their evolution into extraordinary young adults whose combined abilities were limited only by imagination and commitment to improving the world. And that, Benjamin thought with deep contentment, was the greatest education any teacher could hope to receive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.